Is your congregational grief and loss model adequate? I ask you that question not only for those of you that are dealing with congregations in transition as you come to the season of closure, but I think we have a much broader reality going on in our congregations because of what's going on in our culture, because of the pandemic and the COVID realities and restrictions. There's been a lot of loss. There's been a lot of things that have to be grieved in order for congregations to be able to move forward. So I think on a lot of different levels, what I have to say today might be relevant for a lot of situations. Now, I'm speaking, I know, mostly to people that are involved with churches in transition, and so this will definitely relate to that. But as you rub shoulders and come in touch with situations where people are dealing with the adversity because of something they have lost, I think you're going to find what I have to say helpful. And I know that this definitely will need to become a longer training session where we can dive deep into this. I'm just going at the 30,000 foot level to give you some ideas. Oftentimes when we think of grief and loss, we think of this model, this kind of 5-stage process that is common to us that are familiar with the Kubler-Ross model and sort of that roller coaster of loss and change. We're going to come back to this in a little bit, but what I want to do today is give you 3 principles that you can think about as you consider guiding a congregation after a loss that is COVID sensitive. So these 3 principles are simply, they go like this. Number 1 is you need to model the way. That starts with you as the leader. And if you didn't watch last week's video, I would encourage you to go back there because I talk about, is your grief and loss model adequate as a leader, as a person, as a follower of Jesus? Is it robust enough? Is it holistic enough? Does it have enough elements to be fully dynamic and helpful for you? And you've got some food for thought. You will only be able to lead the people that are under your care as you yourself are being led and as you are leading yourself. You need to be the change, and especially when you're dealing with the emotional aspects of grief and loss, if you have unresolved issues in your life as a result of your losses, your difficulties, adversities, the things that you haven't properly grieved, that will impact your leadership. So number 1 principle is work on yourself. Grieve your own losses. Get the help you need. Surround yourself with the community. Do the reading. Do the hard work of grieving your own losses. And that puts you in a place of readiness to help others with their losses. So principle number 1, model the way. Principle number 2 is facilitate storytelling. There's a quote that I've kind of modified that I came across a few weeks ago. People stay stuck in their trauma, in their grief, you could add in there, in the absence of an empathetic witness. I'm a firm believer that when you're dealing with congregations, dealing with groups of people, whether it's families, congregations, they need the opportunity to tell their story. Now, obviously, they need to be willing to tell their story, but you have to create those safe places where they can be reminded and they can go back through their history. One of the best tools that we have, that we teach transitional leaders how to use, is the history wall, which at some point in the very near future, we want to spend some more time on really teaching you and showing you how to do that, especially in these COVID sensitive times. I was talking to a colleague the other day about doing a history wall when you can't have large groups gathered. And we talked about the idea of being able to adapt this facilitating of the storytelling around a history wall so that you do it in smaller groups and do multiple groups and then somehow are able to share the combined story in a future format. So open to your ideas. I'd love to hear what some of you are doing as it relates to facilitating storytelling when there's limitations on the number of people that can actually meet. No doubt it can be done online with well-crafted questions that you can use with a group of people, a small group of people or a larger group of people, potentially on a Zoom call, for example. But that's a key principle to consider, allowing people creating these safe places. And that's where an outside objective transitional leader can be very powerful, because they don't come with the emotional baggage and triggers that sometimes are there by people that have been there through the history, and it's not necessarily that safe place. So facilitating storytelling is key, and to thinking about it in terms of how do you do it with the limitations that we face. The third principle is to consider expanding your grief model. And I talked about this last week in last week's video, but I want to return to it today just for a minute, because I am becoming a believer that the 5-step process that I shared earlier is inadequate, and that you need to consider the mini puzzle piece model. So let me just show you this, and I want to make a few comments about how I see this working as it relates to congregational grief and loss, and helping people with their tell their stories and do their journey. So the puzzle piece model, if you didn't listen in last week, is basically a robust model that sees the grief journey, the journey of loss, and dealing with closure and all the various elements that can be a reality, as a number of puzzle pieces that don't necessarily get inserted in a particular order. But it's a large enough model that allows you to add different pieces depending on the situation so that you can use them. So I'm not going to go into detail. I just want to do a quick overview. Here's some ideas for closure with congregations and how the puzzle piece model might help you, and you might want to consider this. So here's this empathetic listening piece, the storytelling I talked about. Individually, exercise is helpful, but I would add, when you're working with people, it's good to involve them in some type of movement. I think that's why a history wall can be so helpful, because it gets people up, moving around, and when people move around and get their body involved in these conversations and in these activities, it can be a powerful addition to just having them sit there and be stoic. And movement can generate emotion and energy. Normalizing suffering is still adequate. It's helping people in their grief and loss realize that this is normal. It's not unusual for us to have had loss, for us to have had something to grieve, that's life, that's the journey that we need to prepare for and accept. Journaling, I'd like to expand that to this idea of, if you involve people in writing things down, then it helps them to articulate what they're feeling, what they're sensing. That's where the history wall, that type of an activity, is a writing activity where people write things on notes and so on. I'm going to include a detailed description of that for those of you that aren't familiar with that in the notes underneath this video. You're cultivating a growth mindset. It's not about a fixed mindset that says, I know everything I need to know. No, you want to cultivate. No, God is up to something here. He wants us to grow through this, to be open to new ideas and new approaches and new ways to thinking about things. History wall, I think, is a good way to think about this grief cleanse I talked about last week. That the history wall can be very helpful in bringing out into the light some of those hurts that haven't fully been brought into the light and been grieved and been healed. And I would add in there healing prayer, where people, when it touches a real nerve or a real soft spot in their hearts, the grief journey needs to allow for them to be prayed for and to offer prayers themselves, prayers of forgiveness, prayers of confession, where we can allow God to really touch us deeply when those losses and those hurts are exposed and need to be processed. So there's 3 principles that I want you to consider. Scroll down, leave me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. Model the way, facilitate storytelling, expand your grief model. And as we step into this next season ahead of us, we're going to bump into situations where those people we're working with need help, need empathetic leaders who are able to help them deal with the emotion, deal with the losses, deal with these uncertainties that are all around them. So my encouragement to you is step into the challenge. God is with you. We're here as a community, and stay tuned for more on this, because this is an area I think we all could continue to grow in. Thanks, and have a great day.